The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of what was about to unfold. It was an old building, with oak-paneled walls and high ceilings that gave off a sense of dignity and history. Dust floated through the sunlight that cut in from tall windows, and every footstep echoed in the stillness. On that morning, it looked like any other day of proceedings. The clerks shuffled papers, the attorneys whispered in hushed tones, and the bailiff stood firm by the door, his hands crossed in front of him. But there was something about the air that carried a strange tension, like a storm waiting to break. Before the case was called, life in the courthouse still carried its routine rhythm. Secretaries typed out notes on their keyboards, lawyers adjusted their ties, and police officers leaned against the walls waiting. Outside, the streets hummed with their own separate lives, vendors pushing carts, children walking to school, people rushing to work. They had no idea that inside those walls, a story was about to unravel that would blur the lines between justice, loyalty, and the past. The man at the center of it all sat in the defendant's chair, dressed in a plain suit that did little to hide the fatigue etched into his face. His shoulders were hunched as if he carried more than just the weight of the trial. To anyone else he looked like any other accused man, another person waiting for judgment. But there was something about him, something that set him apart. His eyes, dark and restless, held a history that no one in that room could yet understand. He kept them fixed on the table before him, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the wood. The judge entered with his usual quiet authority, the rustle of his robe echoing as the room rose to their feet. His face was calm, lined with years of service and decisions that had shaped the lives of many. He moved with confidence, the kind of man who had long learned to keep his emotions steady, no matter what case landed in front of him. But even as he took his seat, something in his gaze flickered when he glanced toward the accused. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but real enough to leave him unsettled. The people in the gallery shifted in their seats, unaware of the hidden thread binding the two men together. To them, this was just another trial, another crime, another defendant, another search for truth. They didn't see the small pause in the judge's breath, or the way his hand lingered on the gavel a moment too long. The accused had once lived a very different life, far away from the courtroom and its suffocating walls. He had grown up in the same quiet town as the man who now presided over his fate. Back then, life had been simpler, filled with the sounds of summer days and the laughter of children playing until dusk. The two of them had shared a bond that only childhood can forge, built on scraped knees, secret hideouts, and promises whispered under the fading light of day. But time has a way of unraveling even the strongest ties, and the years had pulled them apart into two very different worlds, one climbing into respect and honor, the other stumbling into shadows he couldn't escape. In the weeks leading up to this trial, whispers had already begun to circle. The crime itself had shocked the community. Rumors spoke of betrayal, of greed, of violence carried out in moments of desperation. Those close to the case knew that there were deeper wounds beneath the surface, scars that stretched back years, even decades. The lawyers spoke in calm voices as they prepared, but underneath their professionalism was a quiet acknowledgement. This case wasn't ordinary. There were too many layers, too much history tangled in the facts. The prosecution was determined to expose the truth, and the defense was ready to challenge it at every turn. But no one yet realized how personal this trial would become for the man holding the gavel. The judge sat, his face neutral, but his thoughts restless. A memory stirred. Two boys racing down a dirt road, one always a step ahead, both laughing until they couldn't breathe. He pushed it down, forcing his focus back to the courtroom. A judge could not afford to carry memories into the chamber. Justice was meant to be blind, untouched by the past. Still, something in him knew that the past had already walked in, sat down in front of him, and was now staring back. Life had seemed ordinary for all the players once. The defendant had been a husband, a father, a man trying to hold his life together. Behind the walls of his home, though, there were cracks. Tensions that went unspoken, debts that grew heavier, choices that were made out of desperation rather than strength. Those who knew him said he had once been good, kind even, but that something had changed. A man can only carry so much weight before it drags him down. Now, as the first words of the trial were spoken, the air seemed to thicken. The jurors leaned in, pens ready, faces attentive. The defendant raised his eyes for a moment, and in that glance, the judge felt the full force of recognition. It was him, the boy from long ago, the friend he had once trusted more than anyone else in the world. The courtroom carried on as if nothing had shifted, but for the judge, the ground beneath him no longer felt steady. He had sworn an oath to serve justice, to treat every man the same. But how could he, when the man before him wasn't just another face, but a ghost from his own life? The trial had only just begun, yet already it felt like a story that reached far beyond the crime itself. It was about more than evidence and testimony. It was about friendship, betrayal, power, and the question that hung heavy in the silence of that room: when justice meets the past, which one wins? The weeks before the crime unfolded like a slow burn, the kind of fire that doesn't show its danger until it's already too late. Beneath the surface of everyday life, tensions had been building, pressing against the fragile balance of control. From the outside, everything seemed steady, but behind closed doors, whispers turned to arguments, and arguments to storms that no one could contain. The defendant's life had begun to unravel long before the courtroom knew his name. He had once been a man who worked hard, who carried himself with pride, but the cracks started to show in places only those closest to him noticed. The debts had piled higher than he could admit, each promise of payment delayed until the phone calls grew sharper and the knocks on the door more insistent. His wife tried to hold him together, reminding him of the man he used to be, but even her patience began to falter. Money had a way of corroding love, turning tenderness into blame, and the air inside their home was thick with words left unsaid. It wasn't just money. There was pride too, the heavy kind that makes a man hide his wounds instead of asking for help. He couldn't stand to let others see him broken, especially those who had once looked up to him. In a town where reputations mattered, where every failure became someone else's gossip, he felt the walls closing in. To the neighbors, he still put on a smile. But behind that mask was anger, fear, and a desperate need to regain control of something, anything. The people he surrounded himself with weren't helping either. Old friends who promised solutions came with their own agendas. They spoke of opportunities that shimmered like gold, but rotted once touched. They fed his hope while tugging him deeper into places he didn't belong, rooms where the rules were different, where favors carried hidden costs. It was in these spaces that his anger grew sharper, his patience thinner. He began to see enemies where there were none, to suspect betrayal even in loyalty. At the same time, there were past grievances that had never truly died. He had always carried a shadow of jealousy toward those who had found success while he stumbled. The judge, though he hadn't yet recognized him as such, was one of those names that always echoed in the back of his mind. Childhood friends once, but adulthood had set them on different paths. While one built a reputation of honor, the other drifted into mistakes that stacked against him like stones. He didn't speak of it openly, but the bitterness lingered. It wasn't just about money or choices. It was about worth, about how life seemed to favor some and punish others, no matter how hard they tried. The pressure only worsened when whispers of betrayal reached his ears. A business partner who turned his back on him, a family member who refused to lend a hand, a friend who distanced himself at the first sign of trouble. Each one left him feeling more cornered. And when a man feels cornered, when he believes the world has stripped him of his dignity, he becomes dangerous. His wife saw the changes in him. The way he clenched his fists when bills arrived, the way his eyes lingered on her as though she were slipping away from him too. Love had been their bond once, but now fear began to seep in. Fear of what he might do. Fear of what he was becoming. She tried to reach him with softness, with reason, but each attempt only seemed to feed his anger. To him, her concern sounded like doubt, her patience like pity. And pity was something he could not stand. Meanwhile, society itself pressed against him with invisible hands. In a small community, everyone knows your story. Every failure, every misstep, every rumor is passed along like wildfire. He felt their judgment in the sideways glances, in the half-hearted greetings, in the way old friends no longer called. To them, he was already falling, and no one wanted to be dragged down with him. The shame burned in him, a fire he couldn't extinguish. There were nights when he sat alone, replaying old memories like a film in his mind, moments when he had been happy, when he had been respected. He thought about the boyhood days when he and his closest friend had dreamed of futures bigger than themselves, back when they believed they'd rise together. Now one sat high in judgment, cloaked in power, while the other felt stripped of everything. The resentment he carried grew heavier, though he could not yet see that it would one day explode in ways that could not be undone. Even those who weren't directly tied to him felt the ripple of his unraveling. Business associates noticed the edge in his tone, the way he snapped at the smallest things. Friends began to distance themselves, sensing trouble but unable to name it. He grew more isolated, and with isolation came darker thoughts. He began to believe that no one wanted him to succeed, that everyone was waiting for his failure. But it wasn't only paranoia. Real threats were looming. Collectors came knocking. Promises he made came due. And in the quiet moments, when the weight of it all threatened to crush him, he thought about desperate solutions. Thoughts that once seemed unthinkable began to feel like the only way out. The crime didn't happen suddenly. It was born slowly, fed by pride, fear, betrayal, and the crushing hand of desperation. Each argument with his wife, each failed attempt to climb out of debt, each betrayal, real or imagined, was another step closer to the breaking point. He became restless, unpredictable. Those around him noticed the change, but couldn't stop it. As the days drew closer, his choices narrowed. He began to plan, though he told himself it wasn't planning, it was survival. He convinced himself that he had no other way, that the world had cornered him and left him with nothing. In that conviction lay the danger, because when a man believes he has nothing left to lose, he can justify anything. And so, the stage was set. The crime was waiting, like a shadow at the edge of everything he touched. He didn't yet know how far he would fall, but every step he took pulled him closer. What began as small lies, hidden debts, and quiet resentments grew into something larger, something that would drag him into the courtroom and place him under the gaze of the man who had once been his closest friend. The rising tension was no longer invisible. It seeped into his voice, his movements, the air around him. Those who crossed his path felt it without needing words. Something was coming, and when it came, it would leave everyone changed forever. The night of the crime came quietly, almost too quietly, the kind of night where the air feels thick and heavy, where silence carries its own warning. The streets were empty, the lamps casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. Inside the small house where it happened, the walls seemed to hold their breath, as though they knew what was coming. The defendant had spent the day restless, pacing, his thoughts circling the same dark places over and over. His mind was a storm of debts, betrayals, and the gnawing sense that he had been pushed past the point of no return. He had told himself it would only be a conversation, just words, nothing more. But in his heart, he knew he wasn't walking into that night with peace in mind. There was too much anger, too much humiliation boiling under his skin. He carried it like fire in his chest, and by the time he reached the door of the man he blamed, his fists were already tight, his jaw already locked. The room where it happened was dim, lit by a single lamp in the corner. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. On the table sat stacks of papers, bills left unpaid, letters unanswered. Each one was a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The confrontation began with words, sharp and fast, words that carried years of frustration. His voice rose with desperation, accusing, pleading, demanding. The other man tried to calm him, tried to reason, but reason had no place in that moment. The emotions cracked wide open. Every humiliation, every failure, every betrayal, real or imagined, spilled into that room. His heart pounded so loud it drowned out thought. His hands shook, his vision blurred with rage. He told himself he was only defending his dignity, only fighting back against the people who had cornered him. But the line between defending and destroying blurred until it disappeared. The moment came in a rush. His hand reached for the object closest to him, a heavy glass bottle left on the counter. He hadn't planned it, not exactly, but the weight of it in his palm felt like power, like control. The other man's eyes widened, shock flashing across his face, and for a split second, time seemed to pause. The defendant could have stopped. He could have dropped it, walked away, left the anger burning inside him. But the storm had taken hold, and he no longer had control over it. The bottle came down hard, the sound sickening as it cracked against bone. A cry filled the room, sharp and cut short, followed by silence. The victim stumbled, reaching out as if to steady himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. Blood spread across the floor, dark and shining in the lamplight. The air filled with the metallic tang of it, thick and suffocating. In that instant, reality shattered. The defendant stood frozen, the bottle still trembling in his grip, his breath ragged and shallow. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body moved again, driven by fear, by panic, by the need to silence the chaos inside him, blow after blow until the room was filled with the sound of breaking, until there was no sound left at all. Then came the silence. A silence louder than any noise, pressing against his ears, making him dizzy. He dropped the bottle and it rolled across the floor, leaving streaks of red in its path. His chest heaved as he stared at what he had done. The man on the ground no longer moved, his body twisted, his face pale. The defendant felt the heat drain from his skin, leaving him cold and shaking. For a moment, he couldn't move. His mind refused to accept it, whispering lies that maybe the man was only unconscious, that maybe it wasn't too late. He knelt, hands trembling as he tried to shake him awake, calling his name. But there was no response, only the stillness of death. Panic set in. His thoughts raced, tripping over themselves. He couldn't think clearly, couldn't breathe. His heart pounded against his ribs as he stumbled back, staring at his blood-stained hands. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in on him. He whispered to himself over and over, "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I didn't mean for this." But the words were empty, swallowed by the truth lying at his feet. Denial clawed at him. He thought about leaving, about pretending it never happened. But the sight of blood on his shirt told him he could never run from this. He thought about calling for help, but fear stopped him. Help would mean questions, and questions would mean the end of him. He had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. In desperation, he moved quickly, grabbing rags to clean the mess, trying to wipe away what he had done. But the stains spread, the smell clung to the air, and the weight of the body on the floor was a truth too heavy to hide. His hands shook harder as he dragged it, trying to cover it, his breath ragged with every movement. Each second stretched into an eternity, every sound in the house amplified, the creak of the floor, the wind against the window, his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, a strange calm flickered through him. He told himself it wasn't his fault, that he had been pushed, cornered, forced into this moment. He clung to the thought like a lifeline, convincing himself he was the victim too. That calm lasted only a heartbeat before guilt roared back, heavier than before. By the time he stumbled into the night, leaving behind a scene drenched in violence, he was no longer the man he had been hours earlier. Something inside him had broken, something that could never be put back together. The crime was done, the silence after it deafening, and the path ahead already clear. He would face judgment, not only from the law, but from the memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The night swallowed him as he walked away, but the echoes of what had happened lingered behind, etched into the walls, into the blood-stained floor, into his own trembling hands. The crime was complete, and with it, the final unraveling of everything he once was. The morning after the crime, the world outside carried on as if nothing had changed. Children walked to school, shopkeepers raised their shutters, and the hum of daily life filled the air. But inside the house where it had happened, silence lingered like a living thing. The defendant sat alone in the dim light, his shirt stained, his eyes red from sleeplessness. He hadn't closed his eyes once since it happened. Every time he tried, the images returned, the sound of the bottle breaking, the weight of the body crumpling to the floor, the smell of blood that seemed to cling to his skin no matter how many times he washed. He told himself over and over that it hadn't been his fault, that he had been pushed to it, that the world had left him no choice. But the more he whispered those words, the less he believed them. His wife knew something was wrong the moment she saw him. The way he avoided her eyes, the way his hands trembled even when he tried to keep them still. She asked him what had happened, her voice soft but filled with fear. He snapped at her at first, told her to leave him be, but then broke down, his voice shaking as he confessed pieces of the truth. Not everything. He couldn't bring himself to say it all, but enough for her to understand the weight of what had been done. She stood frozen, caught between disbelief and horror. This was the man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, now sitting before her with guilt carved into his face. The denial came quickly. She told him it couldn't be true, that maybe it had been an accident, that maybe it could still be fixed. He clung to her words for a moment, desperate for anything that would lessen the reality. But the evidence was there, the stains on his clothes, the tremor in his hands, the hollow look in his eyes. The truth couldn't be washed away. As news spread, the community reacted with shock. White. Spurs turned into shouts. This wasn't just any man. He had once been respected, known for his charm, his friendships, his promise of something better. People struggled to reconcile the image they had of him with the crime that now hung over his name. Some defended him, saying he must have been pushed too far, that there was more to the story than anyone knew. Others turned against him immediately, their voices sharp with betrayal. In a town where everyone's history was known, his fall was felt like a crack through the community itself. For the family of the victim, the pain was unbearable. They couldn't understand how someone they had trusted, someone they had once welcomed into their lives, could commit such an act. Grief filled their days, the kind of grief that doesn't ease but deepens with every passing hour. His absence was everywhere, in the quiet chair at the dinner table, in the phone that no longer rang, in the empty side of the bed. The loss wasn't just of a life, but of a future, of all the moments that had been stolen from them. The media descended quickly, their cameras and microphones turning tragedy into spectacle. Headlines painted the story in bold strokes. Respected man turns killer. Childhood bonds shattered by crime. Every detail was picked apart, every past mistake dragged into the light. Old neighbors were interviewed, Distant friends questioned. Each word added fuel to the fire, shaping public opinion before the trial had even begun. Some saw him as a man crushed by desperation, others as a monster hiding behind a smile. The truth became tangled in the noise of speculation and judgment. Inside himself, the defendant wrestled with guilt and denial in equal measure. At moments he felt crushed, unable to breathe under the weight of what he had done. In others, he built walls of justification, convincing himself that he had been left with no choice, that the world had cornered him. But in the quiet hours, when no one was there to hear him, the walls fell apart. He wept alone, his body shaking, haunted by the sound of his friend's last breath. His wife's world crumbled in silence. She bore the shame of whispers in the grocery store, the stares of people she once called friends. Her children heard things at school, cruel words spoken by classmates, repeating what their parents had said at home. The family became isolated, marked by the crime as though it were their own. She tried to shield them, to hold them together, but she was breaking too. Every night, when the house was quiet, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the man she had loved had ever truly been the same man at all. The legal consequences arrived swiftly. Police at the door, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut, the sight of neighbors peeking from windows as he was led away. He barely resisted, his face pale, his body heavy with resignation. In the interrogation room, under harsh lights, his voice wavered as he tried to explain himself, but the words sounded weak, even to his own ears. The officers listened, their expressions flat, their pens scratching across paper. The judge, upon learning the identity of the accused, felt the ground shift beneath him. Memories of childhood came flooding back. The boy he had once run beside, laughed with, and trusted. Now that the boy was gone, replaced by a man accused of murder, he sat in silence, wrestling with emotions he could not show, knowing that soon he would have to face him not as a friend, but as a figure of justice. The weight of that truth pressed against his chest like a stone. The ripple of the crime spread outward, touching everyone it brushed. Friends who had once shared drinks with him now avoided his name. Employers who had worked with him erased his presence from their records. Old allies disappeared into silence, afraid of being tied to his fall. His story became a cautionary tale, whispered about in hushed tones. Parents told their children to stay away, to learn from his mistakes. But beneath the anger and the judgment, some saw the tragedy for what it truly was, not just the loss of one life, but of two. The man who committed the crime had once been full of promise, full of laughter. He had been loved, trusted, respected. Somewhere along the line, he had lost himself, swallowed by fear, by pride, by desperation. His downfall was not only his own, but a reflection of the cracks in the world around him. The pressures, the expectations, the silence that lets pain fester until it bursts. As the days turned into weeks, the community settled into uneasy silence. The crime had left its mark, carving a wound that would take years to heal. The defendant sat in his cell, staring at the walls, haunted by memories he could never escape. His wife carried the burden of shame, his children the scars of whispers. The victim's family mourned in silence, their grief too heavy to put into words. And the judge, waiting for the trial to begin, wrestled with the impossible task of separating his duty from his heart. The aftermath was not loud, not filled with explosions of anger or outrage. It was quieter, heavier, a grief that pressed into every corner of their lives, a reminder that one night, one moment of fury, had shattered everything. The echoes of that night stretched far beyond the crime itself, shaping the lives of everyone it touched, leaving behind a trail of sorrow, guilt, and questions that would never find answers. The trial arrived like a storm. The town had been bracing for, but could never fully prepare to face. The courthouse filled each day with a mix of familiar faces, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers drawn by curiosity. The defendant sat in the center of it all, no longer a man hidden by shadows, but a figure under relentless light. His name, once spoken with respect, had become a symbol of shame and violence. He didn't fight much in court. The evidence was too strong, and his own silence too telling. His eyes often dropped to the floor, his hands resting limp on the table, as though he had already accepted the verdict long before the jury would deliver it. When the sentence came, the room held its breath. Years behind bars, stripped of freedom, stripped of the life he once knew. His wife sat in the gallery, tears sliding down her face, not only for the punishment itself, but for the man she had lost long before the trial began. She would return to her home, to the whispers of neighbors and the stares of strangers, carrying the burden of being tied to a crime she never chose. His children would grow up with the weight of his name, their own futures shadowed by the choices of their father. The victim's family wept quietly, their grief fresh once more, though the verdict offered a kind of closure. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but justice cannot resurrect the dead, cannot heal the emptiness left in a home, or silence the memories that haunt East. Schneid. They left the courtroom with heavy steps, knowing the sentence was an ending, but not the end of their pain. The judge, seated higher than the rest, carried the heaviest burden of all. He had fulfilled his duty, spoken the words of the law with the weight they demanded, yet in his heart, the conflict lingered. To judge a man who had once been his closest friend felt like carving away a part of himself. He never let it show, but in the quiet of his chambers, the memories returned, the laughter of two boys, the trust they had once shared. He knew justice required distance, impartiality, yet he also knew that sometimes justice carried wounds deeper than crime itself. Outside the courthouse, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Newspapers ran headlines that painted him as a fallen man, a symbol of wasted potential. Television broadcasts debated the pressures that drove him there: debt, pride, desperation. Some used his story as a warning about unchecked anger and the dangers of silence. Others argued that the system itself had failed him, that society had left him cornered with no way out. In a world quick to assign blame, the crime became not just a personal tragedy, but a mirror of broader truths. The town itself was never the same. Small communities thrive on trust, on the belief that everyone belongs to something larger than themselves. But after the crime, that trust was cracked. Neighbors looked at each other differently, questioning what they didn't know about the people around them. It reminded them that darkness can grow quietly, even in familiar faces. Parents became more cautious, friendships more guarded. The wound wasn't only in the families directly touched, but in the very fabric of the community. For the defendant, prison became a world of silence and regret. Days blended into nights, each one marked by the same walls, the same routines. He tried to convince himself that he was still a victim of circumstance, that life had left him with no choice. But when the nights grew long and there was no one to hear him, the truth clawed its way back. He remembered the look in his friend's eyes in those final seconds, the shock, the pain, the betrayal, and no amount of denial could silence it. His punishment was not only the years ahead, but the weight of that memory pressing on him forever. The story left scars far beyond the courtroom. The victim's family lived with a hole in their lives that no justice could fill. The defendant's family lived with the shame of his choices, the label of being connected to a killer, and the judge, who had once shared childhood dreams with the man now behind bars, carried the quiet grief of knowing that justice sometimes demands the severing of bonds we once thought unbreakable. The case also raised questions that reached beyond the town. Was justice only about punishment, or was it also about understanding the forces that lead a person to such a breaking point? It showed how pride, Desperation and silence can weave together into a noose that tightens until there is no escape. It forced people to think about how communities rest upon to those who stumble, whether they offer help or turn their backs. And it revealed the thin line between dignity and destruction, how quickly one can slip from being respected to being condemned. At its heart, the story was about the fragility of human nature, about how power, reputation, and pride can shape a person, and how those same forces can break them. It was about the complexity of morality, how right and wrong aren't always clear when desperation takes hold. And it was about the cost of choices, the ones we make in anger, in fear, in silence, that ripple far beyond ourselves. In the end, justice was served in the way the law demands. A crime was punished, a sentence handed down. But the deeper truths lingered. 2 families destroyed, a community fractured, and a judge left questioning the weight of justice when it collides with memory and friendship. The story did not close neatly. It left behind echoes that would carry on for years, in whispered conversations, in the scars of children, in the quiet reflection of those who once believed they were safe from such darkness. The conclusion was not about victory or closure. It was about loss. Loss of life, loss of trust, loss of innocence. It reminded everyone that crime is not only the act itself, but the shadows it leaves behind. And in those shadows, the questions remain. How do we balance justice with mercy? How do we carry the weight of betrayal without letting it destroy us? And how do we recognize the cracks in those we love before they break into something we can never repair? This story ended in a courtroom with a gavel striking wood, but its lessons reached far beyond those walls. It stood as a reminder of the fragile line we all walk, the choices that define us, and the haunting truth that sometimes the greatest tragedies are born not from monsters, but from men who once seemed just like us.